tucked it into the back of his pants, and went into the kitchen to make coffee. Eli was fascinated by kitchens, by the way people ordered their lives, the cabinets they used, the places they kept food, and the food they chose to keep. He'd spent the last decade studying people, and it was amazing how much could be gleaned from their homes. Their bedrooms and bathrooms and closets, of course, but also their kitchens. Serena's coffee was in the lowest cabinet over the counter, just beside the sink, which meant she drank a lot of it. A small black 2 to 4 cup coffee maker sat tucked along the tile backsplash, another clue she lived alone. The apartment was far too nice for an underclassman, one of those lottery-only wins, and Eli wondered absently as he pulled out a filter if she'd used her talents to get this, too. He found the coffee cups to the left of the sink and tapped the coffee maker, eager for it to brew. As soon as it did, he filled his cup and took a long sip. Now that he was alone, his mind was making its way faithfully back to the topic of how he was going to eliminate Serena, when the front door opened and she walked in, flanked by 2 men. One was a police officer, and the other was Detective Stell. Eli's heart lurched in his chest, but he managed a careful smile over his mug as he leaned against the counter to hide the gun tucked into the back of his pants. "Good morning." "Morning," said Stell, and Eli watched confusion spread through his features beneath a glazed calm, which Eli quickly recognized as Serena's doing. It had been nearly 10 years, during which the Lockland case had gone stone cold, and during which Eli had constantly thought of Stell, casting backward glances to see if he would follow. Stell hadn't, but he clearly recognized him now. How could he not? Eli was a photograph, unchanging. Yet neither he nor the officer reached for their weapons, so that was promising. Eli looked to Serena, who was beaming. "I have a present for you," she said, gesturing to the men. "You really shouldn't have," said Eli slowly. "This is Officer Frederick Dane and his boss, Detective Stell." "Mr. Cardale," said Stell. "I go by Ever now." "You two know each other?" asked Serena. "Detective Stell was on Victor's case," offered Eli, "back at Lockland." Serena's eyes widened in recognition. Eli had told her about that day. He'd left out most of the details, and now, staring at the only man who'd ever even had reason to suspect him of foul play, potentially of extraordinary play, he wished he'd given her the entire truth. "It's been some time," said Stell. "And yet you haven't changed, Mr. Ever. Not at all." "What brings you to Merritt?" cut in Eli. "I transferred a few months ago. Change of scenery? Followed a rash of killings." Eli knew he should have broken up the path, the pattern, but he'd been on a roll. Merritt had attracted an impressive number of EOs by virtue of its population and its many dark corners. People came to the city thinking they could hide. But not from him. "Eli," said Serena, "you're ruining my surprise. Stell and Dane and we've had a good long chat, and it's all been arranged. They're going to help us." "Us?" asked Eli. Serena turned back to the men and smiled. "Have a seat." The 2 men obediently sat down at the kitchen table. "Eli, can you pour them some coffee?" Eli wasn't sure how to do that without turning his back and his gun on the cops, so he reached for Serena instead and pulled her close. Another small act of defiance. The motion had the easy movement of a lover's embrace, but his grip was tight. "What are you doing?" he growled into her ear. "I was thinking," she said, tipping her head back against his chest, "about how tedious it must be, trying to find each EO." She wasn't even bothering to lower her voice. "And then I thought, there must be an easier way. It turns out the Merritt Police Department has a database for persons of interest. Of course, it's not meant for EOs, but the search matrix, that's what you called it, right?" Officer Dane nodded. "Yes, well, it's broad enough that we could use it for that." Serena seemed thoroughly proud of herself. "So I went to the station and I asked to talk to somebody involved with EO investigation. You told me, remember, that some of them were trained for it, and the man at the desk led me to these fine gentlemen. Dane is Stell's protege, and they've both agreed to share their search engine with us." "There's that us again," said Eli aloud. Serena ignored him. "We've got it all figured out, I think. Right, Officer Dane?" The lanky man with the dark, close-cropped hair nodded and set a thin folder on the table. "The first batch," he said. "Thank you, officer," said Serena, taking up the file. "This will keep us busy for a little while." Us. What on earth was happening? But even as Eli's thoughts spun, he managed to keep his hand away from the gun against his back and focus on the instructions Serena was now giving the cops. "Mr. Ever here is going to keep this city safe," she told them, her blue eyes shining. "He is a hero, isn't he, officers?" Officer Dane nodded. At first Stell only looked at Eli, but eventually he nodded too. "A hero," they echoed. Chapter 12. This afternoon, the Falcon Price Project. Dane whimpered faintly from the floor. Victor leaned back in the fold-out chair, locking his fingers behind his head. A switchblade dangled loosely from one hand, the flat of the blade skimming his pale hair. It wasn't strictly necessary, but his talent was most effective when it amplified an existing source of pain. Officer Dane curled in on himself on the concrete floor, his uniform torn, blood streaking across the floor. Victor was glad Mitch had put some plastic sheeting down. He'd gotten a little carried away, but it had been so long since he'd stretched, so long since he'd let go. It cleared his head. It calmed him. Dane's hands were still firmly bound behind his back, but the tape over his mouth had come off, and his shirt clung to his chest with sweat and blood. He'd given up the database's access codes, of course, and quickly at that. Victor had tested them on his phone to be sure. Then, with a bit more encouragement, he'd told Victor everything he knew about Detective Stell. His earlier days in Lockland, his transfer on the heels of a killing streak, Eli's work, no doubt, and Dane's own training. All cops these days, it turned out, learned an EO protocol, whether they were skeptics or believers, but at least one man in every precinct knew more than the basics, studied the indicators, and took charge of any investigation where an EO was even suspected. Stell had been that man 10 years ago at Lockland, and he was that man again here, and grooming Dane to follow. Not only that, but somehow Eli had convinced the detective in charge of the investigation against him to help him. Victor shook his head in wonder as he tortured the details out of Dane. Eli never ceased to amaze him. If he and Stell had been working together since Lockland, that would have been one thing, but this was a new arrangement. Stell and Dane had only been assisting Eli since last fall. How had Eli conned the Merritt PD into helping him? "Officer Dane," said Victor. The cop cringed at the sound of his voice. "Would you mind telling me about your interactions with Eli Ever?" When Dane didn't answer, Victor stood and rolled the man onto his back with the tip of his shoe. "Well?" he asked calmly, leaning on the officer's broken ribs. Dane screamed, but once the screams had given way to gasps, he said, "Eli Ever is a hero." Victor let out a choked laugh and put more weight on Dane's chest. "Who told you that?" The officer's expression shifted. It was stern, but remarkably level when he answered, "Serena." "And you bought it?" Officer Dane looked at Victor as if he couldn't quite grasp the question. And then Victor got it. "What else did Serena say?" "To help Mr. Ever." "And you did?" Officer Dane looked confused. "Of course." Victor smiled grimly. "Of course," he echoed, pulling the gun from his belt. He rubbed his eyes, swore quietly beneath his breath, then fired 2 quick shots into Officer Dane's chest. This was the first person he'd killed since Angie Knight, if you didn't count that one man in prison back when he'd been perfecting his technique, and Victor didn't. And certainly the first intentional murder. It wasn't that he shied away from killing. People simply weren't any good to him dead. After all, pain didn't have much effect on corpses. As for Dane's murder, it was unfortunate, albeit necessary, and the fact that a modicum of regret was all that Victor felt on the matter might have bothered him more, or at least been worth a moment of introspection, had he not been so preoccupied with bringing the dead man back. Mitch ducked through the plastic sheeting and into the room at the muffled sound of the gunshots. He pulled on gloves and already had a spare sheet of plastic tucked under one arm, just in case. He looked down at the officer's body and sighed, but when he started taking up the plastic on the floor, and Dane with it, Victor held out a hand and stopped him. "Leave him," he said, "and go get Sydney." Mitch hesitated. I don't think—" Victor spun on him. "I said go get her." Mitch looked profoundly unhappy, but did as he was told, leaving Victor alone with the officer's corpse. Chapter 13. Last Fall, University of Merit. Serena ushered the detectives out and returned to the kitchen to find Eli looking pale and bracing himself against the sink. Everything about him was coiled, the tension in his face something she hadn't seen, not in her presence, since the accident, and it sent a thrill through her. He looked mad. At her. She watched as he slid the gun from his back and set it on the kitchen counter, but left his hand on top. "I should kill you," he growled. "I really, really should." "But you won't." "You're crazy. Those are my murders Stell's investigating, and you just let him in." "I didn't know about you and Stell," said Serena lightly. "Actually, it makes this even better." "How so?" "Because the whole point was to show you." "That you've lost it?" She pouted. "No, that I'm of more use to you alive." "I thought you had a death wish," said Eli, "and bringing back a man I've worked to avoid for a decade doesn't put you on my good side, Serena. Don't you think the cogs are turning in Stell's mind somewhere past that spell you cast on him?" "Calm down," she said simply. And sure enough, she could see the anger bleeding away, watched him try to cling to it as it thinned into nothing. She wondered what it felt like to be under her influence. Eli's shoulders loosened, and he let go of the counter while Serena flipped through the file Officer Dane had left for them. She plucked up a piece of paper, letting the rest fall to the table. Her eyes wandered absently over the page. A man in his 20s, handsome but for a scar that squinted one eye and carved a line down to his throat. "What about your sister?" asked Eli, pouring more coffee now that his hands had stopped shaking. Serena frowned and looked up. "What about her?" "You said she was an EO." Had she? Had that been one of those confessions murmured in half-sleep, the space where whispered thoughts and dreams and fears slipped out? "Spin again," she said, trying to hide her tension as she nodded at the folder. She didn't like to think about Sydney, not now. Her sister's power made Serena ill, not because of the talent itself, but because it meant she was broken the way Serena was broken, the way Eli was broken. Missing pieces. She hadn't seen Sydney, not since leaving the hospital. She couldn't bear the thought of looking at her. "What can she do?" pressed Eli. "I don't know," lied Serena. "She's just a kid." "What's her name?" "Not her," she snapped. And then the smile was back, and she was passing the profile in her hands to Eli. "Let's try this one. He sounds like a challenge." Eli looked at her for several long moments before he reached out and took the paper. Chapter 14. This afternoon, the Esquire Hotel. Eli sat waiting for the call to go through and watching Serena as she crossed the hotel suite to the kitchen. Finally, the ringing stopped, and a brusque voice answered. "Stell here. What is it?" "It's Ever," said Eli, taking the stupid glasses off. Serena was busying herself with the coffee pot, but he could tell from the way she tipped her head, the way she made so little noise, tiptoeing through the motions, that she was listening in. "Sir?" said the detective. Eli didn't like the way he said the word with a faint uptick at the end. "How can I assist you?" Eli didn't know when he dialed the number if calling Stell was actually a good idea, or if it only seemed like one because it came from Serena. Now that he was talking to the detective, he realized that it wasn't a good idea at all, that it was, in fact, a very bad idea. For 9.5 of the last 10 years, he'd been a ghost, managing to stay off radars despite his growing tally of removals and his unchanging face. The pairing of anonymity with immortality was no small feat. He'd managed to avoid Stell until Serena involved him, and even then, everything Eli did, he did alone. He didn't trust other people, not with knowledge or with power, and certainly not with both. The risk here was high, probably too high. And the reward? By indoctrinating an entire police force, he ensured both their support, with regard to Victor and his other targets, as well as sanction to continue his executions, his removals. but it meant tethering himself to the one person he knew he couldn't trust and couldn't resist. The police wouldn't be listening to him, not really. They would be listening to Serena. She met his eyes across the room and smiled, holding out a mug. He shook his head, no, a small action that made her smile. She brought the cup to him anyway, nested it right into his empty hand, and curled her fingers and his around it. "Mr. Ever?" prompted Stell. Eli swallowed. Whether it was a good idea or not, he knew one thing. He couldn't afford to let Victor get away. "I need to set up a meeting," he told the detective, "with your entire police force as soon as possible. I'll call them in, but it will take time for them to get here." Eli looked at his watch. It was almost 4. "I'll be there at 6, and pass the word to Officer Dane." "Well, if I can find him." Eli's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? I just got back from a scene at the bank with your boy Lynch, and there's no sign of Dane. Must have stepped out for a smoke." "Must have," echoed Eli. "Keep me posted." He hung up and hesitated a moment, turning the phone over and over in his hand. "What's wrong?" asked Serena. Eli didn't answer. He was able to resist answering, but only because he didn't know. Maybe nothing was wrong. Maybe the cop had gone on break or cut out early. Or maybe his senses tingled the way they did when Stell's words tipped up, the way they did when he knew he was following Serena's will instead of his own, the way they did when something was off. He didn't question the feeling. He trusted it as much as the quiet that followed his skills. Which is why Eli dialed Officer Dane's number. It rang, and rang, and rang. Victor paced the gutted room of the half-built high-rise and pondered the problem of Serena Clark, who, it seemed, was quite an influential person. No wonder Eli was keeping her around. Victor knew that he would have to kill her very, very quickly. He looked around the space and considered its potential and his options, but his attention drifted invariably back down to Dane's body, which lay sprawled in the middle of the floor on its plastic sheeting. Victor decided to do what he could to minimize the signs of torture, for Sidney's sake. He knelt beside the corpse and began to straighten it up, align the limbs, do what he could to give the body a more natural appearance. He noticed a silver wedding band on Dane's finger. He slid it off and into Dane's pocket, and then placed the man's arms at his sides. There was nothing he could do to make the body look less dead. That would fall to Sidney. Several minutes later, when Mitch returned, holding aside a curtain of plastic and showing Sidney in, Victor was quite proud of the job he'd done. Dane practically looked peaceful, aside from the shredded uniform and the blood. But when Sidney's eyes snagged on the body, she stopped and let out a small sound. "That's bad, isn't it?" she asked, pointing to the badge on the corpse's chest. "Killing a cop is bad." "Only if it's a good cop," explained Victor. "And he wasn't one. This cop was helping Eli track down EOs. If Serena hadn't turned you over, this man would have." So long as he was under Serena's spell, he thought, but didn't say it. "Is that why you killed him?" asked Sidney quietly. Victor frowned. "It doesn't matter why I did it. What matters is that you bring him back." Sidney blinked. "Why would I do that?" "Because it's important," he said, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "And I promise to kill him again right after. I just need to see something." Sidney frowned. "I don't want to bring him back." "I don't care," snapped Victor suddenly, the air humming to life around them. Mitch shot forward, putting his hulking form in front of Sidney, and Victor caught himself before he lost control. All three seemed surprised by the outburst, and guilt, or at least a pale version of it, tightened in Victor's chest as he considered the other two, the loyal guard and the impossible girl. He couldn't afford to lose them, their help. He corrected himself. Their cooperation, certainly not today. So he drew the energy back into himself, wincing as he grounded it. "I'm sorry," he said, letting out a low breath. Mitch took a small step to the side, but didn't abandon Sidney. "Too far, Vic," he growled in a rare display of boldness. "I know," said Victor, rolling his shoulders. Even with the energy grounded, the desire to hurt someone still coiled inside him, but he willed it to stay contained, just a little longer, just until he could find Eli. "I'm sorry," he said again, turning his attention to the small blonde girl still half hidden behind Mitch. I know you don't want to do this, Sidney, but I need your help if I'm going to stop Eli. I'm trying to protect you and Mitch and myself. I'm trying to protect all of us, but I can't do it alone. We have to work together. So, will you do this for me? He held his gun up for her to see. I won't let the cop hurt you. She hesitated, but finally crouched beside the body, careful to avoid the blood. Does he deserve a second chance? She asked softly. Don't think of it that way, said Victor. He only gets a moment, just long enough to answer a question. Sidney took a breath and pressed her fingertips to the clean spots on the officer's shirt. An instant later, Dane gasped and sat up, and Sidney scrambled back to Mitch's side, gripping his arm. Victor looked down at Officer Dane. Tell me again about Ever, he said. The officer met his eyes. Eli Ever is a hero. Well, that's discouraging, huffed Victor. He fired 3 more shots into the officer's chest. Sidney turned and buried her face in Mitch's shirt as Dane thudded back against the plastic-covered concrete, as dead as before. But now we know, said Victor, toeing the body with his shoe. Mitch looked at him over Sidney's pale hair, his face caught for the second time in as many minutes between horror and anger. What the fuck is that about, Vale? Serena Clark's power, said Victor. She tells people what to do. He slid his gun back into his belt. What to say, what to think. He gestured to the body, and even death doesn't seem to sever the connection. Well, the officer's death, amended Victor silently. We're done here. Sidney stood very still. She'd let go of Mitch and now had her arms wrapped around her ribs, as if for warmth. Victor came over to her, but when he reached out to touch her shoulder, she cringed away. He sank to one knee in front of her so that he had to look up a fraction to meet her eyes. Your sister and Eli, they think they're a team, but they're nothing compared to us. Now come on, he said, straightening. You look cold. I'll buy you a hot chocolate. Her icy blue eyes found his, and she looked as though she had something to say, but she didn't get the chance because that's when Victor heard the phone ring. It wasn't his phone, and he could tell by the look on Mitch's face it wasn't his either. And Sidney must have left hers back at the hotel because she didn't even reach for her pocket. Patting down the officer, Mitch found the device and drew it out. Leave it, said Victor. I think you want to take this one, said Mitch, tossing him the cell. In the place of the caller's name, there was only one word on the screen. Hero. Victor flashed a sharp, dark smile, cracked his neck, and answered the call. Dane, where are you? Snapped the person on the other end. Everything in Victor tensed at the sound, but he didn't answer. He hadn't heard that voice in 10 years. But it didn't matter because the voice, like everything else about Eli Ever, hadn't changed at all. Officer Dane, it said again. I'm afraid you just missed him, said Victor at last. He closed his eyes when he spoke, savoring the moment of quiet on the other end. If he concentrated, he could almost imagine Eli tensing at the sound of his voice. Victor, said Eli. The word was a cough, as if the letters lodged in his chest. I admit, it's clever, said Victor, using Merritt's police database to find your targets. I'm a bit insulted that I haven't shown up on there yet, but give it time. I just got here. You're in the city? Of course. You won't get away, said Eli, the bravado dampening shock as it found its way back into his voice. I don't plan to, said Victor. See you at midnight. He hung up and broke the phone in two, dropping both parts onto Dane's body. The room filled with quiet as he considered the corpse, and then looked up. Sorry about that. You can clean up now, he said to Mitch, who was staring slack-jawed at him. Midnight? Growled Mitch. Midnight? As in tonight? Victor checked his watch. It was already 4. Never put off till tomorrow what you can do today. I get the feeling that's not what Thomas Jefferson meant, muttered Mitch. But Victor wasn't listening. His mind had spent the morning spinning, and now that it was set, now that there were only hours standing in his way, The violent energy quieted, and the calm finally settled over him. He turned his attention back to Sydney. "How about that hot chocolate?" Mitch crossed his arms and watched them go, Sydney's short blonde hair bobbing as she followed Victor out. When she'd taken hold of his arm, her fingers had been ice, and underneath the chill she'd been shaking. That bone-deep kind of shiver that had less to do with cold and more to do with fright. He wanted to say something, wanted to know what the hell Victor was thinking, wanted to tell him that he was playing with more lives than his own. But by the time he found one word he should have said, one small, simple, powerful word: "Stop." It was too late. They were gone, and Mitch was alone in the plastic-shrouded room. So he did his best to swallow the word and the sinking feeling that went with it, then turned to the officer's body and got to work. Chapter 15. A long time ago. Various cities. Mitchell Turner was cursed. Always had been. Trouble followed him like a shadow, clinging to him no matter how much good light he tried to stand in. In his hands, good things broke and bad things grew. It didn't help that his mother died and his father bailed and his aunt took one look at him and waved him on, leaving Mitch to bounce between houses more like hotels, checking in and out, never putting down roots. Most of his problems stemmed from the fact that people seemed to think size and intelligence were inversely proportional. They looked at him, at his hulking frame, and assumed that he was stupid. But Mitch wasn't stupid. In fact, he was very smart. Very smart. And when you were that big and that smart, it was easy to get into trouble, especially when you were cursed. By 16, Mitch had dabbled in everything from back-alley boxing to running books to roughing up thugs who owed money to people who liked money. And yet, it wasn't any of those things that landed him his first stint in prison. In fact, he was innocent. Mitch's curse, his maldición, as a Spanish foster mother had called it, was that bad things had a way of happening around him. The woman had never known its dark extent. She used the term to refer more to broken plates and baseballs through windows and tagged cars. But Mitch suffered from a cosmic case of wrong place, wrong time, and given his many, most illegal extracurricular activities, he didn't alibi out very easily. So when a fight went wrong 2 streets over and left a man dead, and Mitch's knuckles were still raw from the back-alley match he'd won the night before, it didn't look good. He got off that time, but it was barely 2 weeks before it happened again. Another person died. It was uncanny and disturbing, and though Mitch hated to admit it, a little thrilling. Or it would be, if Mitch didn't keep getting caught in the middle. It was becoming a problem, this trail of bodies, because even though he didn't make any of them, it certainly looked that way to the police, and by the 3rd death, Metro PD seemed to think it would be easier to lock him up. Just in case. A hoodlum, a drain on society, only a matter of time. The kinds of phrases tossed around by men playing catch with his life. And just like that, with a curse and a rap sheet he didn't earn, Mitchell Turner went to jail. 4 years. He didn't mind it so much, prison. At least he fit in. In the real world, people took one look at him and tightened their grip on their purses, quickened their pace. Cops took one look and thought, guilty or going to be. But in prison, people took one look and thought, I want him on my side, or I don't want to mess with him, or he could crack my skull in his elbow, or any number of far more useful thoughts. His size became a status symbol, even if it denied Mitch the perks of worldly conversation, and even if the staff considered him with skepticism when he checked out a book and was surprised when he used a word with more than 2 syllables. He spent most of his time trying to hack the prison computer's various safety settings and firewalls, more out of boredom than a desire to cause any real trouble, but at least his curse left him alone. By the time Mitch got out of jail, he looked more the part than ever. The imposing teen had graduated into a towering adult, flecked with the first of many tattoos. Once out, he lasted a month and a half before the curse caught back up with him. He'd gotten a job in food distribution, mostly because he could unload 4 times the weight of any other guy on the truck, and because he liked physical work. He might be mentally cut out for a desk job, but he doubted he'd fit behind most desks. And everything was going smoothly. Shitty apartment and shitty pay, but all legally valid. until a man was beaten to death a few blocks from where his crew was unloading peaches. The cops took one look at Mitch and booked him. No bloody knuckles, and 2 coworkers to swear he had his arms full of fruit the whole time, and none of it mattered. Mitch went straight back to prison. Good behavior and a staggering lack of evidence got him out in a matter of weeks, but Mitch, in a rare display of cynicism, decided that if he was going to go back to jail, and given his curse, it was a matter of when, not if, he might as well commit a crime, since serving time on behalf of others wasn't an entirely satisfying use of his life. And so, Mitch set out to plan the one crime he'd always wanted to commit, for no better reason than it was the subject of books and movies, an archetypal affair involving brains far more than bulk. Mitchell Turner was going to rob a bank. Mitch knew 3 things about robbing a bank. The first that, because of his easily identifiable appearance, he couldn't actually go into the bank. Even if he disabled the security cameras, the people inside would pick him out of a 100-person lineup. With his luck, even if he wasn't in it. The second was that, given the advances in security-based technology, many of which he'd learned about through observation in prison, but knew to be far more evolved in the private sector, a large component of the heist's success would lie in hacking the bank's systems and codes to disable the vault, which could be done remotely. The third was that he would need help, and thanks to the 2 prison stints he'd served so far, Mitch had developed a fairly extensive list of acquaintances, many of which would be stupid, desperate, or otherwise willing enough to take up some guns and set foot inside the bank. What Mitch didn't count on was that while his hacking would succeed without a hitch, the partners with guns would fail spectacularly, be promptly arrested, and drop his name faster than a hat. And somehow, upon seeing Mitchell Turner in all his physical prowess, the police would pin the gun-laden part of the robbery on him, and the hacking on the 3 smaller men caught in the actual heist and clearly discernible, even masked, on the security footage. And so Mitch's 3rd strike landed him not in a prison for tax frauders or info leakers, but in Righton, a maximum security facility where the majority of the inmates had actually committed crimes, and where his size, while impressive, was no guarantee of safety. And where, 3 years later, he would come to meet a man named Victor Vale. Chapter 16. 6 hours until midnight. Merritt Central Precinct. Eli stood against the pale gray wall of the police conference room and readjusted the mask on his face. It was simple, partial, black, running from his temples to his cheekbones, and Serena had teased him for it. But as more than half of Merritt's police force accumulated in the room and took him in, the other half would listen in, he was thankful for the disguise. His face was the one thing he couldn't change, and as bad an idea as this was, it would be infinitely worse if the entire force had a chance to memorize his features. Serena stood at the podium and smiled her slow smile and spoke to the gathering men and women. "What happens at midnight?" she had asked as they drove to the station. Eli had gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. "I don't know." He hated saying those words, not just because they were true or because admitting them meant Victor was a step ahead, but because he couldn't not say them, because the confession crawled its way up his throat before he thought to swallow. Victor had hung up on him with only the promise of midnight, and Eli had been left fighting the urge to throw the phone against the wall. "The man behind me is a hero," Serena was saying now. Eli watched the eyes of the people in the room glaze slightly at her words. "His name is Eli Ever. He has been protecting your city for months, hunting down the kinds of criminals you do not know about, the kind you cannot stop. He has been working to keep you and your citizens safe. But now he needs your help. I want you to listen to him and do as he says." She smiled and stepped away from the podium and its microphone, urging Eli forward with a nod and a lazy smile. Eli let out a low breath and stepped forward. "A little over a week ago, a man named Victor Vale broke out of Righton Penitentiary along with his cellmate, Mitchell Turner. If you're wondering why you didn't hear about the break on the news, it's because it was not on the news. Eli himself didn't know about it until he got Victor's note, until he heard his voice, until he contacted Righton. They'd refused to tell him more, but had been happy to inform Serena, when he handed her the phone, that they'd been ordered to keep the escape quiet due to suspicions about one of the convicts' nature, suspicions that had been put aside until the man in question, a Mr. Vale, incapacitated a good chunk of the Righton staff without laying a finger on them. "The reason you did not hear about the prison break," continued Eli, is because Victor Vale is a confirmed EO. Several heads cocked at the term, torn between Serena's order to listen to him and their own varying degrees of belief. Eli knew that all precincts were given a mandatory day of training on EO protocol, but most of them didn't take it seriously. They couldn't. Decades after the term was coined, EOs were still largely a thing of myths and online forums, kept that way by incidents like the one at Wrighton. Fire smothered instead of spread. It was better for Eli that cases involving EOs were so readily tamped out instead of made public. It gave him an unobstructed path. But he was constantly amazed by how eager the officials were to have incidents forgotten, and how eager the people involved were to forget. Sure, they would always be believers, but it helped that the vast majority of EOs didn't want to be believed in, and those that did, well, they'd saved Eli the trouble of hunting them down. But who knows? Maybe in another world EOs would have come to light by now, and the huddle of uniforms before him would have listened without a shred of disbelief. But Eli had done his job too well. He'd had a decade to cull the crop, cut the numbers down, and keep the monsters largely the stuff of stories. And so out of the crowd, only Stell, who stood at the back of the room, gaze trained on Eli, took in the words without surprise. But now, he continued, Victor Vale and his accomplice Mitchell Turner are in Merritt, in your city, and it is imperative that they are not allowed to escape, imperative that they be found. These men have abducted a young girl named Sidney Clark, and earlier today they killed one of your own, Officer Frederick Dane. The audience stirred at that, shock and anger spilling suddenly across their faces. They hadn't heard the news. Stell had been told, but he still looked gray with shock, and it got their attention. Serena could compel them, but this kind of report would do something different, agitate them, motivate them. I've been led to believe that these men are planning something tonight, by midnight. It is crucial that we find these criminals as soon as possible, but, he added, for the hostages' safety, we must take them alive. 10 years ago, Eli had faltered and let a monster live, but tonight he would correct his error and end Victor's life himself. We have no photographic record for you, he added, but you'll find physical descriptions arriving on your phones. I want you to blanket the city, block off the roads out, do whatever you have to do to find these men before anyone else dies. Eli took a single step back from the podium. Serena came forward and put a hand on his shoulder as she addressed the room. Eli Ever is a hero, she said again, and this time the collected Merritt Police Department nodded and stood and repeated. Eli Ever is a hero. A hero. A hero. The words echoed and followed them out. Eli followed Serena through the precinct as the words sank in. A hero. Wasn't he? Heroes saved the world from villains, from evil. Heroes sacrificed themselves to do it. Was he not bloodying his hands and his soul to set the world right? Did he not sacrifice himself every time he stripped away an EO's stolen life? Where to now? Asked Serena. Eli dragged his thoughts back. They were cutting through the precinct garage to a side street where they'd parked the car. He pulled a thin folder from his satchel and handed it to her. Inside were the profiles of the 2 remaining EOs in the Merritt area, or at least suspected EOs. The first was a man named Zachary Flinch, a middle-aged miner who'd suffocated in a tunnel collapse the year before. He'd recovered, physically. The second was a young soldier named Dominic Rusher, who stood too close to a buried mine and landed himself in a coma 2 years prior. He'd come to and vanished from the hospital. Literally. No one saw him leave. He sprang up in 3 different cities. No path, no trail. Just there and gone and there. Before appearing in Merritt 2 months earlier. And as far as Eli could tell, he hadn't vanished again. Yet. Victor mentioned the database when he called, said Eli as they reached the car. Which means he has access to these files, too. Whatever he's planning, I don't need him adopting any more strays. I want to come this time, said Serena. Eli frowned behind his mask. He always did this part alone. His murders, his removals, weren't like golf or porn or poker, some stereotypically male hobby that he didn't want to share. They were rituals, sacrosanct, part of his covenant. Not only that, but the deaths were a culmination of days, sometimes weeks, of research and reconnaissance and patience. They belonged to him. The planning and the execution and the quiet after were his. Serena knew that. She was pushing him. Anger crackled beneath his skin. He tried to spin the demand in his mind to regain control. He knew he didn't have time to savor these particular kills. Chances were he wouldn't even have time to wait for a demonstration. Today, the rituals would be broken anyway, defiled. He could feel Serena watching him struggle, and she seemed delighted by it, but not subdued. She took the file from him and held up Zachary Flinch's profile. "Just once," she said, the words tipping the scale. Eli checked his watch. It was well after 6, and there was no question she would expedite the process. "Just once," he said, climbing in the car. Serena beamed and slid into the passenger seat. Chapter 17. 5 hours until midnight, the Esquire Hotel. Sydney was perched on the couch, with doll at her feet and the folder of executed EOs open in her lap when Mitch came in. The sun was setting beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she looked up as he pulled the carton of chocolate milk from the fridge. He looked tired as he leaned his elbows. They were dusted with something chalkish and white on the dark granite counter. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Where's Victor?" "He went out." Mitch swore under his breath. "He's crazy. The area's crawling with cops after that stunt." "Which stunt?" asked Sydney, shuffling the papers in the folder. "Killing the cop or answering Eli's phone call?" Mitch smiled grimly. "Both." Sydney looked down at the face of a dead woman in her lap. "He can't mean it," she said quietly. "About meeting Eli at midnight. He doesn't mean it, right?" "Victor means what he says," said Mitch. "But he wouldn't have said it if he didn't have a plan." Mitch pushed off the counter and vanished down the hall, and a moment later Sydney heard the bathroom door shut and the shower snap on. She went back to reading the profiles, telling herself it was only because there was nothing good on television. The truth was, she didn't want to think about what would happen at midnight, or worse, what would happen after. She hated the what-ifs that crawled into her head the moment she lost focus. What if Eli won? What if Victor lost? What if Serena... He didn't even know what to think about her sister, what to hope for, what to fear. There were these traitorous parts of her that still wanted to feel Serena's arms around her, but she knew that now she had to run away from, not toward, her sister. Sydney forced her eyes over the profiles in the folder, tried to focus on the EO's lives and deaths, tried not to picture Victor's photo in among them, a black X across his calm, clear face, and guessed at what their powers were, even though she knew they could be anything. Victor had explained that it depended on the person, on their wants and wills and last thoughts. The last profile was her own. She'd reprinted it after Victor took the first copy, and now her eyes wandered over the photo of her face. Unlike the other candid shots that filled the folder, hers was staged. Head up, shoulders back, eyes leveled directly at the camera. It was a yearbook photo from last year, taken a week or so before the accident, and Sydney had loved it dearly because the camera had somehow, magically, caught her the moment before she smiled, and the proud upturn of her chin and faint crease in the corner of her mouth made her look just like Serena. The only difference between this copy of the photo and the original was that this one had no X drawn through it. Eli knew by now that she was here, alive, and she hoped he felt sick when he'd heard about Barry's body walking back into the bank, when he'd put the pieces together and realized that it was her doing, that a few shots fired into the woods didn't equal a dead girl. Maybe it should have upset her to see her own profile in the dead EO folder, and it had at first, but the shock had worn off, and the profile's existence in the digital trash bin, the fact that they'd underestimated her, assumed she was dead, and most of all, the fact that she wasn't, made her smile. "What's got you grinning?" Sydney looked up to find Mitch, freshly showered, a towel draped around his neck. She didn't realize how much time had passed. That happened to her more than she liked to admit. She'd blink, and the sun would be in a different position, or the show on TV would be over, or someone would be finishing a conversation she'd never heard them start. "I hope Victor hurts him," she said cheerfully. "A lot." "Jesus, 3 days and you're already taking after him." Mitch sagged into a chair, ran his hand over his shaved head. "Look, Sydney, there's something you need to understand about Victor." "He's not a bad man," she said. "There are no good men in this game," said Mitch. But Sydney didn't care about good. She wasn't sure she believed in it.
I'm not afraid of Victor."
"I know." He sounded sad when he said it. Chapter 18. 5 years ago, Wrighton Penitentiary. The third time Mitchell Turner went to jail, his curse followed him. No matter where he went or what he did or didn't do, people kept dying. He lost 2 cellmates at the hands of others, 1 cellmate at the man's own hands, and a friend who collapsed in the yard during the exercise period. So when the slim, polished form of Victor Vale appeared at the door of his cell one afternoon, pale in the dark gray prison uniforms, he figured the man was a goner. He was probably in for laundering, maybe a Ponzi scheme, something heavy enough to make the right people angry and land him in max security, but light enough that he looked thoroughly out of place there. Mitch should have written him off, but, still troubled by the death of his last cellmate, he became determined to keep Victor alive. He assumed he would have his work cut out for him. Victor didn't speak to Mitch for 3 days. Mitch, admittedly, didn't speak to Victor either. There was something about the man, something Mitch couldn't place, but he didn't like it in a primal, visceral way, and he found himself leaning vaguely away from Victor when the latter came near. The other inmates did it too, on the rare occasions that first week when Victor ventured out among them. But even though it made Mitch uncomfortable, he followed the man, flanked him, constantly searching for an attacker, a threat. As far as Mitch could tell, his curse seemed firmly grounded in his proximity to people. When he was near them, they got hurt. But he couldn't seem to figure out how close was too close, how near he needed to be to doom a life. And he thought that maybe, if for once his proximity could save a person instead of somehow marking them, maybe then he could break the curse. Victor didn't ask him why he stayed so close, but he didn't tell him not to either. Mitch knew the attack would come. It always did. A way for the old to test the new. Sometimes it wasn't so bad, a few punches, a bit of roughing up. But other times, when men had a taste for blood, or a bone to pick, or even if they were just having a shitty day, it could get out of hand. He followed Victor to the commons, to the yard, to the lunchroom. Mitch would sit on one side of the table, Victor on the other, picking at his lunch, while Mitch spent the entire time scanning the room. Victor never looked up from his plate. He didn't look at his plate either, not exactly. His eyes had an unfocused intensity, as if he were somewhere else, unconcerned with the cage around him or the monsters inside. Like a predator, Mitch realized one day. He'd seen enough nature specials on the common room set to know that prey had eyes on the sides of their head, were constantly on guard, but predators' eyes were forward-facing, close together, unafraid. Despite the fact that Victor was half the size of most inmates and didn't look like he'd ever been in a fight, let alone won one, everything about him said predator. And for the first time, Mitch wondered if Victor was really the one who needed protecting. Chapter 19. 4.5 hours until midnight. The suburbs of Merritt. Zachary Flinch lived alone. That much Serena could tell before she ever set eyes on him. The front yard was a tangle of weeds. The car on the gravel strip of a driveway had 2 spares. The screen door was torn, and a coil of rope tied to a half-dead tree had been chewed through by whatever was once tied there. Whatever his power, if he even was an EO, it wasn't making him any money. Serena frowned, reconstructing his profile from memory. The entire page of data had been innocuous, except for the inversion, the rebirth principle Eli had called it, a recreation of self. It wasn't necessarily positive, or even voluntary, but always marked, and Flinch ticked off that box with a bold red check. In the wake of his trauma, everything about his life had changed. Not subtle changes either, but full flips. He went from being married with 3 kids to being divorced, unemployed, and under a restraining order. His survival, or revival rather, should have been cause for celebration, for joy. Instead, everything and everyone had fled. That, or he had pushed them away. He'd been to a slew of psychiatrists, had been prescribed antipsychotics, but judging by the state of his yard, he wasn't in a good place. Serena knocked, wondering what would scare a man enough to throw his life away after he'd beaten death itself to keep it. No one answered the door. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and when she exhaled it made small puffs of steam in the dusk. She knocked again, and could hear the sound of the television within. Eli sighed and pressed his back against the peeling paint of the siding by the door. "Hello?" she called. "Mr. Flinch, could you come to the door?" Sure enough, she could make out the shifting of feet, and a few moments later Zach Flinch appeared in the doorway, wearing an old polo and a pair of jeans. Both were a size too big, making it look like he'd withered since putting them on. Over his shoulder she could see the coffee table littered with empty cans, the takeout boxes stacked on the floor beside it. "Who are you?" he asked, dark rings beneath his eyes. There was a gruff tremor in his voice. Serena clutched his dossier to her chest. "A friend. I just have a few questions." Flinch grunted, but didn't shut the door in her face. She held his gaze so he wouldn't see Eli standing a couple of feet to his right, still wearing his black hero's mask. "Is your name Zachary Flinch?" she asked. He nodded. "Is it true you were involved in a mining accident last year, a tunnel collapse?" He nodded. She could feel Eli getting impatient, but she wasn't done. She wanted to know. "In the wake of your accident, did anything change? Did you change?" Flinch's eyes widened in surprise, but even as they did, he answered with a nod, his face caught between confusion and complacence. Serena smiled softly. "I see." "How did you find me? Who are you?" "Like I said, I'm a friend." Flinch took a step forward over the threshold. His shoes tangled in the stray greenish-brown weeds that were trying to reclaim the porch. "I didn't want to die alone," he muttered. "That's all. Down there in the dark. I didn't want to die alone. But I didn't want this." "Can you make them stop?" "Make what stop, Mr. Flinch?" "Please. Make them go away. Drew couldn't see them either till I showed her, but they're everywhere. I just didn't want to die alone, but I can't take it. I don't want to see them. I don't want to hear them. Please. Make them stop." Serena held out her hand. "Why don't you show me what—" The rest of the word was cut off by the gun as Eli swung it up to Zach Flinch's temple and pulled the trigger. Blood streaked across the siding of the house, flecking Serena's hair and dotting her face like freckles. Eli lowered the weapon and crossed himself. "Why did you do that?" she spat, livid. "He wanted to make them stop," said Eli. "But it wasn't done." "I was merciful. He was sick. Besides, he confirmed he was an EO," said Eli, already turning toward the car. "A demonstration was no longer necessary." "You have such a complex," she snapped. "You always have to be in control." Eli gave a low, mocking laugh. Says the siren. "I just wanted to help." "No," he said. "You wanted to play." He stormed away. "Eli Ever, stop!" His shoe caught in the gravel and stuck. The gun was still in his hand. For the briefest moment, Serena's temper got the best of her. She had to bite her tongue to stop herself from making him put the weapon to his own temple. The urge eased, and she descended the stairs, stepping over Flinch's body as she came up behind him. She wrapped her arms around Eli's waist and kissed the back of his neck. "You know I don't want this kind of control," she whispered. "Now put the gun away." Eli's hand slid the weapon back into its holster. "You're not going to kill me today." He turned to face her, wrapped his hands, now empty, around her back, and pulled her close, his lips brushing her ear. "One of these days, Serena," he whispered. "You're going to forget to say that." She tensed in his grip, and knew that he could feel it, but when she answered, her voice was even, light. "Not today." His hands fell away as he turned toward the car and held the door open for her. "Are you coming with me?" he asked as they pulled out of the gravel drive. "To find Dominic?" Serena chewed her lip and shook her head. "No. Have your fun. I'm going back to the hotel to wash the blood out of my hair before it stains. Drop me off on your way." Eli nodded, the relief written across his face as he gunned the engine, leaving Flinch on the porch, one lifeless hand trailing in the weeds. Chapter 20. 4 hours until midnight. Downtown Merritt. Victor made his way back toward the hotel, a bag of takeout beneath one arm. It had been a pretense, really, this errand, a chance to escape the confines of the hotel room, a chance to breathe and think and plan. He ambled down the sidewalk, careful to keep his pace casual, his expression calm. Since the meeting with Officer Dane, the call with Eli, and the midnight ultimatum, the number of cops on the streets of Merritt had gone dramatically up. Not all in uniform, of course, but all alert. Mitch had carved out any photographic evidence from the system, from Lockland University profile pictures down to the mug shots that were logged at Brighton. All the Merritt cops would have to go on was a stick-figure drawing, Eli's own memory, 10 years out of date since, unlike him, Victor had aged, and descriptions from the penitentiary staff. Still, the police weren't to be discounted. Mitch's size made him terribly conspicuous, and Sidney stood out for being a child. Only Victor, arguably the most wanted of the group, had a defense mechanism. He smiled to himself as he strode within reach of a cop. The officer never looked up. Victor had discovered that pain was a spectacularly nuanced sensation. A large, sudden quantity could cripple, of course, but it had many more practical applications than torture. Victor found that, by inflicting a subtle amount of pain on those in a determined radius, he could induce a subconscious aversion to his presence. People didn't register the pain, yet they leaned ever so slightly away. Their attention, too, seemed to bend around him, lending Victor a kind of invisibility. It served him in prison, and it served him now. Victor made his way past the abandoned Falcon Price site and checked his watch again, marveling at the structure of revenge, the fact that years of waiting and planning and wanting would come down to hours, minutes even, of execution. His pulse quickened with the thrill of it as he made his way back to the Esquire. Eli dropped Serena off on the Esquire curb with the sole instruction to pay attention and let him know if she noticed anything unusual. Victor was going to send another message. It was only a matter of when, and as the clock ticked away the minutes until midnight, Eli knew that his level of control would depend almost entirely on how quickly he got the memo. The later it got, the less time he'd have to plan, prepare, and he was sure that was Victor's intent, to keep him in the dark as long as possible. Now, he idled on the painted pavement of the drop-off square in front of the hotel, sliding the mask free and dropping it onto the passenger seat before reaching for Dominic Rusher's file. Rusher had only been in the city a few months, but he already had a history with the Merritt police, a list of misdemeanors consisting almost exclusively of drunken disorderly conduct charges. The vast majority of the trouble had emanated not from Dominic's shitty hole of an apartment in the south part of the city, but from a bar. One particular bar. The Three Crows. Eli knew the address. He pulled away from the hotel, just missing Victor and his bag of takeout. 2 cops stood in the Esquire's lobby, their full attention on a young blonde with her back to the hotel's revolving front doors. Victor wandered in unnoticed and headed for the stairs. When he reached the hotel room, he found Sidney reading on the couch, doll lying beneath her feet, and Mitch drinking straight from a carton at the counter while tapping out code one-handed on his laptop. "Have any trouble?" asked Victor, setting the food down. "With the body? No." Mitch set the carton down. "But it was close with the cops. Jesus, Vale, they're everywhere. I don't exactly blend in as it is." "That's what parking garage entrances are for. Besides, we just have to make it a few more hours," said Victor. "About that," started Mitch, but Victor was too busy scribbling something on a scrap of paper. He slid it toward him. "What's this for?" "It's Dane's ID and passcode for the database. I need you to prepare a new flagged profile." "And who are we flagging?" Victor smiled and gestured to himself. Mitch groaned. "I take it this has to do with midnight." Victor nodded. "The Falcon Price high-rise, ground floor." "The place is a cage. You're going to get trapped." "I have a plan," said Victor simply. "Care to share?" Victor said nothing. Mitch grumbled. "I'm not using your photo. It took me ages to scrub it from the systems." Victor looked around the room. His gaze settled on the latest Vale self-help tome he'd been inking out. He took it up, flashed the spine at Mitch, where Vale was written in glossy caps. "This'll do." Mitch continued muttering even as he took the book and got to work. Victor turned his attention toward Sidney. He carried a tub of noodles to the couch and sagged onto the leather cushions as he offered it to her. Sidney set aside the dead EO folder and accepted the food, fingers curling around the still-warm container. She didn't eat. Neither did he. Victor stared past the windows and listened to the sounds of Mitch composing the post. His fingers itched to black out lines, but Mitch was using the book, so he closed his eyes and tried to find quiet, peace. He didn't picture sprawling fields or blue skies or water drops. He pictured squeezing the trigger 3 times, blood blossoming on Eli's chest in the same pattern it had on his. Pictured carving lines into Eli's skin, watching them fade so he could do it over again. Over and over and over. "Are you afraid yet?" he would ask when the floor was slick with Eli's blood. "Are you afraid?" Chapter 21. 3.5 hours until midnight, the Esquire Hotel. "Do you really have a plan?" asked Sidney sometime later. Victor dragged his eyes back open and said the same thing he'd said in the graveyard when she asked if Wrighton Penitentiary had let him go. The same words and the same tone and the same look. "Of course," he said. "Is it a good plan?" pressed Sidney. Her legs swung from the couch, boots grazing Doll's ears with every pass. The dog didn't seem to mind. "No," said Victor. "Probably not." Sidney made a sound, something between a cough and a sigh. Victor wasn't terribly fluent in her language yet, but guessed it was a kind of sad affirmative, the preteen version of gotcha or okay. The clock on the wall said it was almost 9 p.m. Victor closed his eyes again. "I don't get it," said Sidney a few minutes later. She was scratching Doll's ear with her shoe. The dog's head rocked back and forth gently with the motion. "What don't you get?" asked Victor, eyes still closed. "If you want to find Eli, and Eli wants to find you, why do you have to go through all this? Why can't you just find each other?" Victor blinked and considered the small blonde thing sitting beside him on the couch. Her eyes were wide and waiting, but they were already losing their innocence. What little she'd clung to and brought with her down that road in the rain had faded in the face of Victor's pragmatic execution, his promises, and his threats. She'd been betrayed, shot, saved, healed, hurt, healed again, forced to resurrect 2 men, only to witness the assassination of one of them. She'd gotten tangled up in this, by Eli and then by Victor. She was like a child, but not a child, and Victor couldn't help but wonder if becoming an EO had hollowed her out the way it had him, had all of them, cut the ties of something vital and human. He wasn't protecting her, not by treating her like a normal kid. She wasn't normal. "You asked me if I have a plan," he said, sitting forward. "I didn't, at first. I had options, yes, ideas, and factors, but not a plan." "But you have one now?" "I do. But because of Eli and because of your sister, I only have one shot to get it right. The first person to act sacrifices the element of surprise, and I can't afford to do that right now. Eli has a siren on his side, which means he could compel the entire city. Maybe he already has. I have a hacker, a half-dead dog, and a child. It's hardly an arsenal." Sidney frowned and reached for the folder of living EOs. She held it out to him. "So make one, or at least make yours stronger. Try. Eli sees EOs, us, as monsters. But you don't, right?" Victor wasn't sure how he felt about EOs. Up until he fetched Sidney from the side of the road, he'd only ever known one EO, himself excluded, and that was Eli. If he'd had to judge based on the 2 of them, then extraordinaries were damaged, to say the least. But these words people threw around, humans, monsters, heroes, villains. To Victor, it was all just a matter of semantics. Someone could call themselves a hero and still walk around killing dozens. Someone else could be labeled a villain for trying to stop them. Plenty of humans were monstrous, and plenty of monsters knew how to play at being human. The difference between Victor and Eli, he suspected, wasn't their opinion on EOs. It was their reaction to them. Eli seemed intent to slaughter them, but Victor didn't see why a useful skill should be destroyed, just because of its origin. EOs were weapons, yes, but weapons with minds and wills and bodies, things that could be bent and twisted and broken, and used. But there were so many unknowns. Whether the EOs were still alive wasn't unknown. What their powers were was an unknown. Whether they would be receptive was an unknown, and while Victor possessed a compelling argument, since the other side wanted them dead, and he had use for them alive, the fact remained that to recruit an EO would mean introducing unpredictable and unreliable elements into his equation. Add to that the fact that Eli was probably busy eliminating Victor's options, and it seemed more trouble than it was worth. "Please, Victor," said Sydney, still holding out the folder. And so, to pacify her, and pass the time, he took it, and flipped the cover back. The page with the blue-haired girl had been removed, leaving only 2 profiles. The first profile belonged to a man named Zachary Flinch. Victor had read through the man's page earlier that day, while waiting for Mitch's call, so he knew it was a dead end. Everything about the suspected EO was too ambiguous. An EO's abilities seemed to have at least a tangential relationship to either the nature of death or the subject's mental state, but it was still a guessing game. And the fact that everyone had left in the wake of the accident suggested trouble. More trouble than Victor had time for. He turned to the second profile, the one he hadn't gotten to yet, skimmed the page, and stopped. Dominic Rusher was in his late 20s, an ex-soldier who'd had the misfortune of standing too close to a landmine overseas. The explosion had shattered many of Dominic's bones and left him in a coma for 2 weeks, but it wasn't the coma or his newfound habit of disappearing that attracted Victor's attention. It was the brief medical note at the bottom of the page. According to the military hospital records, Rusher had been prescribed 35 milligrams of methahydrocone. It was a high dose of a fairly ambiguous synthetic opioid, but Victor had spent one rather slow summer in prison memorizing the extensive list of painkillers currently available via prescription, their purposes, dosages, and official names, as well as their medical ones, so he recognized the drug on sight. Not only that, but he felt sure that unless Eli had dedicated the same amount of time, he wouldn't recognize it. Fate, it seemed, was smiling on Victor again. With mere hours until his midnight meeting, he knew there was no time or place for building trust or loyalty, but perhaps these could be supplanted by need. And need, Victor had learned, could be as powerful as any emotional bond. The latter was neurotic, complicated, but need could be simple, as primal as fear or pain. Need could be the foundation of allegiance, and Victor had exactly what Dominic needed. He could supply, if Dominic's power was worth it. There was only one way to find out. Victor folded the profile and put it in his pocket. "Grab your coat, Mitch. We're going out." "Car or foot?" "Car." "Absolutely not. Did you miss the memo about the cops? Last time I checked, that vehicle is stolen." "Well, we'll just have to make sure we don't attract attention then." Mitch mumbled something unkind as he reached for his coat. Sydney ran to get hers from the bedroom where she'd abandoned it. "No, Sid," said Victor when she reappeared, already tugging on her large red coat. "You need to stay here." "But it was my idea," she said. "And it's a good one, but you still have to stay." "Why?" she whined. "And don't tell me it's too dangerous. You said that about the cop, and then you dragged me in anyway." Victor scoffed. "It is too dangerous, but that's not why you have to stay here. We stand out enough without a missing child, and I need you to do something for me." Sydney crossed her arms and considered him skeptically. "If I'm not back by 10:30, he said, "I need you to hit the post button on Mitch's computer and upload my profile to the database. He has the window up and ready." "Why 10:30? asked Mitch, buttoning his coat. "Long enough for someone to see it, but hopefully not long enough for them to be prepared. It's a risk, I know." "Not the biggest one you're taking," said Mitch. "Is that all?" asked Sydney. "No," said Victor. He patted down the pockets of his coat. His hand vanished, then came out with a blue lighter. He didn't smoke, but it always seemed to come in handy. "At 11, I need you to start burning the folders, all of them. Use the sink." He held out the lighter. "1 page at a time, you understand?" Sid took the small blue device, turning it over in her hands. "This is really important," he said. "We can't be leaving evidence around, okay? You see why I need you here?" At last, she nodded. Doll whined faintly. "You're going to come back, right?" she asked when they reached the door. Victor looked over his shoulder. "Of course I will," he said. "That's my favorite lighter." Sydney almost smiled as the door shut. "I get burning the papers, but why 1 page at a time?" asked Mitch as he and Victor were headed down the stairs. "To keep her busy." Mitch thrust his hands into his coat. "We're not coming back then, are we?" "Not tonight." Chapter 22. 3 hours until midnight. The Three Crows Bar. Eli sat in a booth along the back wall of the Three Crows and waited for Dominic Rusher to show up. He'd checked with the bartender when he first arrived and had been assured that Rusher came every night around 9 o'clock. Eli had been early, but he had nothing else to do besides wait for midnight and whatever that would bring, so he ordered a beer and retreated to the corner booth, savoring the time away from Serena more than the booze. The drink was mostly for appearances anyway, since regenerating negated its effect and alcohol without inebriation was far less enticing. He'd been carded, too, and the novelty of that had long worn off. But the distance from Serena was important, vital, he'd found, to maintain his slim hold on control. The longer he was with her, the more things seemed to blur, an intoxication Eli's body didn't overcome so easily. He should have killed her when he had the chance. Now, with the police involved, it was messy. Their loyalty was to her, not to him, and they both knew it. A new city, that's what he needed. After midnight and Victor and this whole mess was sorted out, he'd find a new city, start over, away from Detective Stell, away from Serena too if he could help it. He didn't even mind the prospect of his old method, the time and dedication it took, the weeks of searching for the mere moments of payoff. Things had gotten too easy lately, and easy meant dangerous. Easy led to mistakes. Serena was a mistake. Eli took a sip of beer and checked his phone for messages. There were none. Eli had hunted here once, a few years back, before Serena, when he was still a ghost, just passing through. The place was loud and crowded, made for people who liked to surround themselves with chaos instead of quiet. Ambient noise built of glass and shouting and music, to which you could never discern the lyrics. It was an easy place to be invisible, to vanish, swallowed by the low light and the din of drunk and drinking and angry people. But even knowing that, Eli was neither bold enough nor foolish enough to perform a public execution. Serena might have secured him the police, but the people in the Three Crows weren't much for cops or conformity. A problem could escalate into a disaster in a place like this, especially without Serena to soothe the masses. Eli reminded himself again that he was glad to be rid of her influence, both over others and over him. Now he could, out of want and necessity, do this his way. He checked the time. Less than 3 hours until what? Victor had set the deadline to rattle him, put him on edge. He was disturbing Eli's calm, like a kid dropping rocks into a pond, making ripples, and Eli saw him doing it and still felt rippled, which perturbed him even more. Well, Eli was taking back control of his mind and his life and his night. He drew his fingers through the ring left by his beer glass on the old wood table, before writing one word in the film of water. Ever. Chapter 23. 10 years ago, Lockland University. Why ever? Victor posed the question from across the table. Eli had just died. Victor had just brought him back. Now the two were sitting in a bar a few blocks down from their apartment, buzzed from several rounds, or at least Victor was, and the fact they'd been lucky enough to survive an acute attack of stupidity. But Eli felt odd. Not bad, just different. Distant. He couldn't put his finger on it yet. Something was missing, though. He could feel the absence of it, even if he couldn't deduce the shape. Physically, though, and he supposed that mattered most, all things considered he felt fine, persistently so, suspiciously so, given that for some time that evening he had been an inanimate object instead of a living being. "What do you mean?" he asked, sipping his beer. "I mean," said Victor, "you could pick any name. Why pick Ever?" "Why not?" "No," said Victor, waving his drink. "No, Eli, you don't do anything like that." "Like what?" "Without thinking. You had to have a reason." "How do you know?" "Because I know you. I see you." Eli drew his fingers through a ring of water on the table. "I don't want to be forgotten." He said it so softly he worried Victor wouldn't hear, not over the chatter of the bar, but he clamped his hand down on Eli's shoulder. For a moment he looked so serious, but then he let go and slumped back in his seat. "Tell you what," said Victor. "You remember me, and I'll remember you, and that way we won't be forgotten." "That's shit logic, Vic." "It's perfect." "And what happens when we're dead?" "We won't die then." "You make cheating death sound so simple." "We do seem awfully good at it," said Victor cheerfully. He lifted his glass. "To never dying." Eli lifted his. "To being remembered." Their glasses clinked as Eli added, "Forever." Chapter 24. 2.5 hours until midnight, the Three Crows Bar. Dominic Rusher was a broken man, literally. Most of the bones on his left side, the side nearest the IED, were pinned or screwed or synthetic. The skin pocked with scars beneath his clothes. His hair, for 3 years buzzed to military standards, had grown out, and now hung shaggy around his eyes, one of which was fake. His skin was tan and his shoulders strong, his posture still too straight to blend entirely with the bar's regulars, and despite it all, he was clearly broken. Eli didn't need the files to tell him any of that. He could see it as the man walked up to the counter, slid onto a stool, and ordered his first drink. Time was ticking past, and Eli's grip tightened on his own glass as he watched the ex-soldier kick off his night with a Jack and Coke. He had to resist the urge to abandon the booth and the beer and shoot Dominic in the back of the head just to be done with it. Eli did his best to smother the flare of impatience. His rituals existed for a reason, and he would, and had, compromised them on occasion, but would not abandon them even now. To slay without cause would be an abuse of power and an insult to God. The blood of EOs washed from his skin. The blood of innocence would not. He had to get Dominic out of the bar, had to get a confession if not a demonstration before he executed him. Besides, Dominic would make fine bait. So long as he was instilled at the bar and in Eli's sight, he was as useful alive as he was dead, because if Victor came looking for the broken man and made his way here before midnight, Eli would be waiting, and he would be ready. Victor drove while Mitch lay sprawled across the back seat, as out of sight as possible given his mass. The city slid by, the greens and reds and office window whites streaking past as Victor wove the car through the gridded streets, out of the downtown and into the old sector. They kept to the roads that curled through the side streets of Merritt instead of the main grid that ran in and out of the city, avoiding any street that eventually led to a toll or a bridge or any other potential checkpoint. They watched their speed, pacing traffic when it was too fast because going too slow would stand out just as much as speeding. Victor guided the stolen car through Merritt, and soon the numbered avenues and lettered roads gave way to named streets. Real names, trees and people and places, clustered buildings, some dark, boarded, abandoned, and some bulging with life. "Take a left," said Mitch, consulting the card-sized, shifting map on his phone. Victor checked his watch and ticked off the time it was taking to get to the bar, subtracted it from midnight to figure out how long they really had. He couldn't be late. Not tonight. He tried to find calm, find peace, but excitement rattled inside him like loose change. He wrapped his free hand on his leg and swallowed the whisper that this was a bad idea. It was better than sitting still. Besides, they had time. Plenty of time. "Left again," said Mitch. Victor turned. They'd spent the first half of the driving going over the plan, and now that it was laid out and all that remained was to execute it, they drove in a silence punctuated only by Mitch's directions and Victor's restless tapping, and the roads rolling away beneath them. While Victor drove, Mitch wondered. Wondered if he would survive the night. Wondered if Victor would too. Wondered what tomorrow would bring if they both did. Wondered what Victor would do to occupy his thoughts once Eli was gone. If Eli was gone. Mitch wondered what he would do next. He and Victor had never discussed their partnership in terms and termination. But it had always been about this, about finding Eli. There was never any mention of what would come next. He wondered if there was a next in Victor's mind. The moving green dot on his phone reached the red still dot that marked the Three Crows bar, and Mitch sat up. "We're here." Victor parked in the lot across from the bar, even though it was crowded and narrow and would prevent a quick exit, especially under pursuit. But with a stolen car and the cops on high alert, He didn't dare do anything that might stand out. He wasn't about to get picked up for a parking ticket on a stolen car. Not tonight. He shut off the engine, stepped out, and examined the huddle of bricks across the street that declared itself to be the Three Crows Bar, a trio of metal birds perching on a sign above the front doors. To the left of the bar was an alley, and as the two men crossed the street, Victor could make out the bar's side entrance set into the stained brick wall. When they reached the curb, he made his way toward the alley, and Mitch made his way toward the bar. Behind his eyes, Victor saw the pieces of his game lining up on the city-shaped board: chess and battleship and risk. His move. "Hey," he called as Mitch's hand gripped the front door. "Be careful." Mitch smiled crookedly and went inside. Chapter 25. 5 years ago, Wrighton Penitentiary. "You want more milk?" It was the first thing Victor Vale ever said to Mitchell Turner. They were sitting in the cafeteria. Mitch had spent 3 days wondering absently what Victor's voice would sound like if he ever decided to talk, if he even could talk. Over the course of lunch, Mitch had actually taken to imagining that he couldn't, that beneath the collar of his prison-issued shirt, some ghastly scar carved a smile across his throat, or that behind his curling lips there simply was no tongue. It sounded weird, but prison was boring, and Mitch found his imagination going to strange places more often than not. So when Victor finally opened his mouth and asked with perfect elocution if Mitch wanted another carton of milk, the latter was caught between surprise and disappointment. He scraped his words together. Yeah, sure." He hated how stupid he sounded, how slow, but Victor only chuckled and pushed up from the table. "Keeps the body strong," he said before making his way across the cafeteria to the food counter. The moment he was gone, Mitch knew he should have followed. He'd spent 3 days shadowing his new cellmate, but the question had caught him off guard, and now, in its wake, he had a sinking feeling that he'd just sacrificed his chance to break the curse. He craned his neck in search of Victor, only to have someone slam him forward toward the table and swing an arm around his shoulder. From across the room, the gesture might have looked friendly, but Mitch could see the sharpened metal in Ian Packer's hand, the edge angled toward his cheek. Mitch was twice the man's size, but he knew the damage Ian could do before he'd be able to wrestle him off. Besides, Packer was one of those people who, despite his size, had power here, sway. Too much in a place this small. Hey, said Packer, his breath foul. "Playing puppy dog?" "What do you want?" growled Mitch, keeping his eyes on the tray in front of him. "Been wanting you to play watchdog for my group for a year. Been so kind and patient with your pacifistic shit." Mitch was surprised and a little impressed that Packer knew the word pacifistic. "And suddenly this pointy prick shows up and you're all over the roll." He tutted in Mitch's ear. "I should fuck him up just for wasting your time and talent, Turner." A small carton of milk landed on his tray, and Mitch looked up to find Victor standing there, surveying the situation with mild interest. Packer's grip tightened on the sharpened metal as his attention flicked to the new man, and Mitch's heart sank. Another cellmate lost. But Victor only tilted his head curiously at Packer. "Is that a shiv?" he asked, bringing his shoe to rest on the bench, his hand to rest on his knee. "We didn't have those in isolation." Isolation, thought Mitch. "I've always wanted to see one." "Oh, I'll show it to you close, you little fuck." Packer's arm vanished from Mitch's shoulders. He lunged for Victor, who did nothing more than set his foot back on the floor and curl his fingers into a fist, and Packer, halfway to him, buckled to the ground, screaming. Mitch blinked, confused by what had happened, and not happened. Victor had never even touched the guy. The room broke into motion at the sound of the scream, the inmates on their feet and the guards on their way, as Mitch sat and watched, and Victor stood and watched, and Packer howled and writhed on the floor, hand bloody from clenching the sharpened sliver of metal as he twisted and screamed. There was a moment, before anyone else reached them, when Mitch saw Victor smile. A wolf smile, thin and sharp. "What's going on?" shouted a guard as he and another reached the table. Mitch looked to Victor, who only shrugged. The smile was gone, a faint crease of concern between his eyes. "No idea," he said. "Guy comes over to talk. 1 minute he's fine, and the next—" Victor snapped his fingers and Mitch flinched. "Just starts convulsing. Better get him checked out before he hurts himself." The guards pinned the writhing Packer to the floor and pried the blade from his shredded hand as his screams faded into groans and then into nothing. The convict had fainted. Somewhere between Packer attacking Victor dropping him with a look, and the guards reaching the scene, Mitch had extricated himself from the table bench and now stood a few feet behind his cellmate, sipping his milk and watching the events unfold, marveling in part at the scene and in part at the fact that for once he hadn't been blamed. But what the hell had happened? Mitch must have whispered the question because Victor honored him with a pale, raised brow before turning back toward the cell blocks. Mitch followed. "Well?" asked Victor as they made their way down the concrete halls. "Do you feel I'm wasting your time and talent?" Mitch considered the impossible man beside him. Something had changed. The discomfort, the aversion that he'd felt for 3 straight days had faded. Everyone else still seemed to bend away as they passed, but Mitch felt only wonder and, admittedly, a touch of fear. When they reached their cell, and he still hadn't answered, Victor stopped, rested his back against the bars, and looked at him. Not at his hulking shoulders or his meaty fists with their scarred knuckles or the tattoos that ran up his neck, but at his face. He looked him in the eyes, even if he had to look up a bit to do so. "I don't need a bodyguard," said Victor. "I noticed that," said Mitch. Victor let out a cough of a laugh. "Yes, well," he said, "I don't want everyone else to notice, too." Mitch had been right. Victor Vale was a wolf among sheep, and it took a lot to make 463 hardened criminals look the part of prey. "So, what do you want, then?" Victor's lips curled into that same dangerous smile. "A friend." "That's all?" he asked, disbelieving. "A good friend, Mr. Turner, is very hard to find." Mitch watched Victor push off the bars and head into the cell, lifting a library book from his cot before settling onto it. Mitch didn't know what had just happened back in the cafeteria, but a decade in and out of prison had taught him this. There were some people you had to stay away from, people who poisoned everything in reach. Then there were people you wanted to stick with, the ones with silver tongues and golden touches. And then there were people you stood beside, because it meant you weren't in their way. And whoever Victor Vale was, whatever he was, and whatever he was up to, the only thing Mitch knew was that he did not want to be in his way. Chapter 26. 2 hours until midnight, the Three Crows Bar. Eli tapped his phone awake, tensing when he saw the time. Still no Victor, and Dominic seemed to be an installation at the bar. Eli frowned and dialed Serena, but she didn't pick up. When her voicemail kicked in, he hung up, eager to click end before her slow, melodic words could issue any instructions. He thought of Victor's threat. "It's clever, using the police database to find your targets. I'm a bit insulted I haven't shown up on there yet, but give it time. I just got here." Eli logged onto the database hoping for clues, but it was after 10, and the only flagged profile belonged to the man currently stationed at the counter, nursing his 3rd Jack and Coke. Eli frowned and put the phone away. His bait didn't seem to be drawing any fish. The seat beside Dominic emptied. It had been taken up and subsequently abandoned 3 times over the course of the hour, and Eli, tired of waiting, finished his beer and slid to the edge of the booth. He was about to make his way toward the target when a man appeared, approached the counter, and took the stool. Eli stopped and hovered at the edge of his booth. He had seen the man before, in the lobby of the Esquire, and even though his presence here was less surprising, he fit in much better with the customers of the Three Crows than the suit-wearing clientele of the 4-star hotel. His appearance still jarred Eli. There was something else